Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Shop Talk. Today we have a return guest. He actually previously spoke on our sister podcast with Derek Cluley and Seth Peterson. Welcome, Dr. Greg Kawchuk. The paper we're going to talk about is a 2023 paper. It is available open access. Title of the paper is A 2-Year Follow-Up, Twitter Activity Regarding Misinformation About Spinal Manipulation, Chiropractic Care, and Boosting Immunity During the COVID-19 Pandemic. Greg, wonderful to have you on. Do
So
you
great to
mind
be here,
just
Chad.
do you mind just introducing yourself? Talk a little bit about your background.
Yeah, just very briefly, there's the version I have and the version my mom would like me to use, but that's quite a bit longer. So uh, my background began as undergrad in biochemistry, and then that led to a degree in chiropractic, which I practiced for about 15 years. Most recently in that, or the latest point would have been at the University of Calgary, in like one of the first places that ever had a chiropractor practice on campus in Canada. And then I was recruited to the University of Alberta in Edmonton as a Canada Research Chair, where I've been full-time research since then, and now am full professor in the Department of Physical Therapy in the Faculty of Rehabilitation Medicine. And my areas are, basically anything to do with the spine, whether it's on the cellular level, we've done things on genetic levels, all the way up to policy. So it's my interest, it's my passion, and there's almost nothing you won't see us get involved in.
Yeah, I was actually going to mention that everybody I talked to has worked with you in some form or fashion, and including me. We work together on
Yeah,
ForceNet.
full
So,
disclosure. Yeah.
but it's a real pleasure having you on.
Yeah, people, that's one of the benefits of our profession, isn't it? Is working on these projects with good colleagues and discovering things together and building those relationships. So thanks for having me, Chad.
Indeed, my pleasure. I want to ask first, you were part of a global scientific chiropractic community that wrote a paper about pseudoscientific uh, suggestions, I think, about immunity. And the paper was extremely timely. I think it was published in March of 2020. Can you go back then and just tell me what was the impetus behind that? Was it COVID, or were you working on that before COVID?
Yeah, no, I think the timing was from COVID. In fact, it was one of a number of activities or statements that were made by different groups about this growing amount of information, who I think most of us would say misinformation about what it is manipulation can do, or chiropractic or any profession. We studied a number of them with respect to boosting or improving one's immunity. So there was I think similar to a lot of things where you see a group of people get together and add their signatures as a common voice. That was one that happened in chiropractic around the same time as these papers as well. So uh, it seems so long ago now, doesn't it? The pandemic is kind of in the rear view, and hindsight, is 2020, what we should have done, what we could have done. And I think these papers that we're going to talk about today are really exciting because they're a glimpse into something that maybe we hope will never happen again. But the way that it's like a detective story. I think it could be a novel in the way that all these things came together all at the same time. You had this global health problem with no one able to converse about it other than on these social media platforms. And then a way to analyze, what was said and capture what was said. So it was a very unique set of circumstances that came together to produce something that I'm really not sure you could even do these papers today for mostly for technical reasons, but some of how social media has evolved now compared to where it was just even a few years ago.
Oh, it has evolved a lot. And you are also referring to, I think the original paper was in 2020 when you actually looked at misinformation on Twitter about COVID in chiropractic. Can you go back then and just talk a little bit about what was the trigger? What was the premise behind that one?
Yeah, yeah, I think this is a fair way of reflecting in hindsight. But at the time, as we saw this ramp up globally to the point where it was formally declared a pandemic in March of 2020, there had been a real increase in traffic in social media about this, of course, right? Everyone was talking about what it could mean, what was going to happen. And this was the same thing about treatments, because if you can think back and remember that long ago, when the pandemic was first declared, there was no treatment, right? And that was a lot of what was worrisome, is how, we saw all the pictures from Italy and everything, and what were we going to do about it? And at the same time, with social media and things, I think this idea that, healthy lifestyle, including some type of intervention of some kind, the spinal manipulation in this case, would just keep you healthier, and that would be a good thing. And then that gets extended to boosting your immunity. So before the pandemic, and the first paper looked at this, we could actually go back in time, in a bit of a time machine, and look at the year before the pandemic. And the only time that these concepts are mentioned, about come on in and get your immunity boosted by spinal manipulation, it happened at times when either it was back to school, you're going to be around a lot of kids and, get your immunity up, or it was a regular messaging service that people would subscribe to. And for that week, it was a message about immunity. So things would spike in social media from that. But otherwise, it's pretty quiet, right? It isn't something that anyone was really talking about. But then, wow, pandemic comes along. There's no vaccines. There's no treatments. And all of this information came out in a matter of months of what you could do to presumably boost your immunity in this coming pandemic. So as we saw that, and the discussions and arguments and things that were happening online, it just so happened that friends of ours' son went to work for a big social media agency. He'd been a business graduate from here at the University of Alberta. And he's telling me about one of their products that was able to essentially search the social media landscape in a way that we would with the biomedical literature. So you could tell it what to search. It could be Twitter, it could be Facebook, it could be combinations from this time to that time. Look for certain words. Who are the influencers? So it was this really cool tool that was mostly used by big companies to follow their products and see, what response were people liking this new thing that they had rolled out. I think famously there was someone in the NBA who blew out of one of their Adidas or Nike shoes. And because of this software, they were on it right away. They could see the response within hours and mounted, a defense against it and such. So we thought, wouldn't this be cool if we took, what corporate business world uses to look at conversations on social media, what they mean, what their significance is, and apply that to this circumstance where there really, in our mind, hadn't been a lot of discussion about this. But now here was the opportunity for probably a lot of closely held beliefs about what could or couldn't happen with manipulation suddenly boil over, and everyone's making statements 2 and 4. So this or 4 and against, and that was the impetus of the first paper, was to really try to capture this thing. And Twitter was very different at the time.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like really, that's why I said I'm not sure if you could do it again today, in that we've had the blue check marks and, it's been sold and the filters are different and any number of things. But back then, it's a fire hose of conversation where there's no little groups, you don't belong to, the dog lovers group and only the dog lovers group can see what's being said. Everyone can see everything. And that really made it an interesting experiment to see what the discussion was. And this tool was the tool that allowed us to do it.
Yeah, and I think you're talking about Talkwalker, and and what was interesting, I think, in your 2020 paper when you looked, I believe you wrote that you found an equal amount of people that were spreading information in support of chiropractic manipulation boosting immunity versus the amount of people providing caution against that. Is that correct?
Yeah. The first paper, we actually did a pretty extensive search, because Talkwalker, unlike some of the free ways of accessing Twitter information that only go back like 30 days, and that may have changed to 30, 90 days. This could go back a whole year. And we were able to see how things had really shifted. And it was pretty clear that, you could make a dividing line between ideas and statements and concept that were in support of the idea that spinal manipulation could boost human immunity, and then the ideas that refuted that. So that was pretty clear cut to, and then there's some like odd things, that have the word immunity in it, or neutral statements like, wash your hands, hashtag chiropractic. So they're just a neutral statement about these kinds of things. But we were able to show that there were these, basically two camps of ideas when you sorted through it all, and that's where the first analysis took place. And we looked at not just the words that related to manipulation and all its synonyms, and but also the professions that were associated with it. So we opened up the filters to look at. We had it to the profession, the act, and then if there's a mention of immunity, and all the wild cards and things you can imagine to make sure we covered everything about it. And what we actually saw is there was a lot of activity about mentioning immunity and spinal manipulation in all the professions, but most of the professions died down pretty quickly, and that content varied a little bit from the chiropractic content that wasn't as high in volume, but at least in the first study, we could see it looked like it was being sustained from when the initial pandemic was declared. So that's where we wanted to get that out as soon as possible. I mean, we all kind of thought the pandemic was going to last a couple of months or weeks back then, remember?
Mm-hmm.
And but so we stopped the study and said, here's this little snapshot in time. And then, of course, it kept going and kept going, and then we decided it would be worth doing a follow-up, which doesn't really happen very often in these kinds of studies, right? That you get a chance to look at how things evolved over a long period of time. And that's the second study, the 2-year follow-up.
Yeah, let's talk about that. In your second study, and I know your first study, you found that initially it was more individuals that were active on Twitter, and then the organizations came in a little bit later and made their reported on their stance, which I think is pretty normal. Tell us about your second study on that carryover from 2020 to, I guess, 2023, when you did more of a longitudinal analysis.
Yeah. So there were some similarities, first of all, between the two papers. If you looked at the total numbers of tweets, of statements made, that you're in support of this idea or you refute this idea, they're remarkably similar. Like there's the same volume of tweets out there saying like, yes, spinal manipulation can improve immunity, or no, that's not the case. But what was really different between those two groups is that the group who refute this idea had so much more engagement in the social media world. Their statements were liked more or retweeted. So all these measures of engagement. So yes, they were reaching the same number of people, but then in terms sort of the same number of tweets. But when you looked at how many followers each group had and how many of these were being liked and retweeted, 3 times as many on the side of the idea that this should be refuted, the idea that manipulation can improve or boost human immunity. So that was the real big finding, is that now those worlds might not talk to each other, they might not follow the same people, but at least in the world that was coming out against this idea, the reach and the extent on social media was far, far larger. And that persisted into the second study as well. So the ratio stayed about the same, but we saw that from the pandemic over the 2 or 3 years, overall, the ideas, the number of tweets were declining. There was a steady drop off over the years, but a very sharp drop off at one point after a number of organizations came out and made particular statements. Now, can you hook that up, cause and effect? No, you could just say it's coincidence, but there's definitely a point in time where a number, and we could see this in the paper, there's I think a good 12 different statements or so of different associations, different groups, regulators, saying, no, you can't represent this. It's not truth. It's not fact. It's not science. And then we saw a really sharp drop off. And in fact, the drop off wasn't equal between the two groups. Drop off occurred at a faster rate for the statements that were made promoting the idea that SMT can boost immunity. So it wasn't just a natural lag that everyone took part on. It seemed like the people who were making the misinformation statements sat up and took notice and changed their social media behavior.
Well, that's actually good to hear. Were there any surprises when you looked, like any particular groups that were slow to respond or that maybe responded in a way that you wouldn't have thought?
Well, there were, to be fair, there were some organizations that doubled down and said, no, we think there is evidence. Not anywhere as many as the groups who said, no, this isn't a thing. And then I think at the time we even wrote in the paper, we pointed out that, where were these institutions all along? They've banded together. In some cases, many organizations and schools and things came together and made unified statements. Others just made their own. But looking back on it and just what we were talking to before we started recording, right? Keeping up a social media presence is a lot of expense and a lot of work. And I think the people who we saw in the studies as the really big influencers, the ones with the big followings, they're managing their own personal social media empires. I don't think we see that in our associations, our regulators, our schools, that their social media presence is all that much. So I think it was probably consistent with their overall activities on social media. We probably would have liked to have seen more engagement or continued engagement or less general, more specific. But I think overall it's pretty consistent with the social media activities that you see with those organizations.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And as you know, it takes so much time and effort to have a strong social media presence. And then most of those organizations are volunteer organizations. So I imagine it's quite hard to really to mobilize the barge on that end of it.
Yeah, I think there's some room though for certainly, responding in real time or close to real time and having that kind of responsiveness takes a lot of work. But I think I still would like to see some of these organizations turn this more into policy in the long term, right? Certainly, there were a lot of organizations that had this as policy already, and they would just have to trot this out and say, no, 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 that's not in scope or whatever the case may be. But there's still some others who are, kind of having it both ways. They said, this isn't really what we understand the science to be right now, but haven't really come out in with an official statement or policy yet that I think would be, refreshing to have. But all in all, I mean, let's step back for a second and say, when have you seen a profession really bind together like that and have such a positive effect on what is said within the community, whether it's by law through regulation or otherwise? I think it's a tremendous message that says, you can make a difference in the stuff that you join and that you belong and be part of. So I think it's a really interesting story and positive message in the end.
So I agree. And in your paper, by the way, you had this really wonderful geospatial map of the different places that the origins around the world where most of the information. Did you see a particular pattern in that, or did it really just reflect where most chiropractors practice in those different countries? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think we have a lot of speculation about it. Interestingly, the majority of where chiropractic colleges are located, as well as other schools, that practice manipulation, is in the United States. And I think there's probably some. We weren't able to do any analysis by age because age and occupation, a few of these other things are actually not part of the information we get from Twitter. Talkwalker can make an assumption about it, but we didn't want to use that kind of data. So it may be that this skews to certain age groups within certain countries, practitioners of a certain era versus younger practitioners. We don't know that. We have an assumption about it, but I think some of certainly the mass of chiropractic is in the United States. And we saw that most of the messaging around the idea that immunity can be boosted with manipulation came from the United States, whereas in other countries that wasn't the case. Europe, I believe Australia and Canada, which is interesting because you might think that Canada would just be an extension just because of their geographic proximity in terms of beliefs and perspectives, but it was quite different, quite different. So clearly there's some regional differences in opinion about this and understanding of the science.
Yeah, we see it too. I think with physical therapy, I think there's a pretty big difference in PT in Canada and the United States too. Um, but also osteopathy. I mean, the way that it's looked at in the United States or North America in comparison to Europe or South America, I think you see variability among professions quite a bit. So I do have a question for you. You had mentioned that, things have changed quite a bit with social media, and you looked at the Twitter platform, which is now X, and indeed, I think X is quite different than what it used to be. Um, I have moved away from it because um, I don't, it's not rewarding to me to interact like it used to be. Do you have any suggestions on how to make it work for, the average clinician who's looking to get information, that's looking to interact with other individuals? Any suggestions on how to make it work? Or how does it work for you?
Yeah, we haven't talked about that before, but it's funny that I almost have the same um, trajectory that you've just described, and that it seemed to be, and in a way still does. It's a place where people will pass around information of certain types, and you kind of get in that circle, right? And so for if you're interested in the science of manipulation or things like that, there's a group of people who are passing around papers and talking about them. And I think that's persisted to some extent, but it gets harder to find and is drowned out by a lot of other stuff. Um, and there's some maybe guilt by association of being on certain platforms or others and you think at the end of the day, there's maybe better ways to communicate about science. I think if it's how you get your news and other things like that, we've all seen the warnings about those kinds of things. And there's probably some truth to that with any form of media and communication. But I've I've used it less, and largely because I don't see it as a research tool anymore because of the changes. I don't think we could do what we did with TalkWalker in the same way. So I think there was a window that opened. I'm so glad we took advantage of it because I think it illuminated something really important. We knew those thoughts were out there, but we didn't know how well the profession could respond either, which was really great. And now maybe things will change a bit, or someone else will pick up the torch. But I think it's pretty hard to get at the totality of social media the way we used to be able to on Twitter.
I agree. So we had one of your colleagues on, Casper Nim, and this was after your all's paper on specificity of the manipulation. And Casper had mentioned he received a lot of negativity from individuals after publishing that paper. And you've always been on the side of science, and which sometimes I think um, causes friction with a lot of old theories and old philosophies. Did you get any negativity at all when you published this from anyone?
Uh, not really, not in the way that some other ideas that we've all challenged have generated some negativity. But I think it's fair to say, right? This is part of the process in a way, right? Here's something that we kind of took at face value and it makes sense, and someone comes along and rocks the boat. I think it's all fair to say, you, me, all of our colleagues, like if that turns on a dime tomorrow, we'll get behind that if the evidence is there for that. So if it actually there's compelling evidence and a body of evidence and reproducible evidence that says SMT boosts immunity, like that's our job to figure that out and to promote that if that's the case. Um, so I think people in Casper's case, this is a newer idea that hasn't really been presented in such a coherent way through his papers, and it's challenging. It's not to say it won't change one way or another tomorrow, but in this case, I think the sad things I heard was that like you just let people go out and earn a living during the pandemic. It's tough out there. Quit being so, if you're saying this stuff, it's losing some people some work. And I don't think that has to be the case because you can uptake science and have it be part of your practice and do very well. If your entire practice is based on a premise that is being challenged by scientific thought, then you've put your eggs in one basket and you sleep in the bed you've made. And sometimes that works out to be great, right? For all of us who are on the low back pain side of things right now, that seems to be some good evidence for this, but maybe not so much on some of the other conditions that traditionally have been thought to be helped by manipulation. Now, again, it can change, but it doesn't look like there's a lot of support for that right now.
Gotcha. So, Greg, those were two very good, very novel papers. Anything you would like to share with our listeners that we haven't touched on from these papers? Any last words that you want to mention?
Well, yeah, there was a third paper actually, which was related, Chad. No, you wouldn't have seen it, but in context of Twitter. But it was also a paper we did about regulators using very sophisticated tools to look at what chiropractors or others are saying on social media as a way of proactively determining what's happening in the profession with what's being said or not. And I say it's not just chiropractors because these tools we know have been used with other regulators, whether I believe acupuncture, physical therapy. So, generally the system that a regulator operates on is someone has to come forward with a concern, right? And there's no one driving around the community looking out for infractions, until someone actually says, I've got a concern and I would like to report it and have this investigated. But now this is taking things to the next step where before someone would have to say, I'm really concerned, with what Greg Kawchuk or Chad Cook has said on their social media platform. I think it contravenes their scope of practice or what. So someone would have to come forward and do that. And that probably left some opportunity there for people to say things that weren't necessarily consistent with the evidence, but no one ever said anything. Now with these tools, regulators can proactively go out and search for these things. And we illustrate a couple of examples of that in the paper where that happens. So I think social media presence isn't this thing that the thing I'd like to leave your readers with. It's like what you tell your kids, right? About what you post on the internet stays on the internet, and it's the same in your professional career. And there's people who will actually hold you accountable to that now, and that's becoming an increasing trend, I think. It's not easy to do. It takes some expense, but I think more and more regulators are taking an active role in regulation rather than this passive role built on the public having to check a box that there's been an infraction.
Very nice. And we've seen that a little bit on the PT side too, with
Yeah.
some things that people have said and professionalism and behaviors and such. So, Greg, on behalf of all of us, thanks for combating misinformation. Love your work, love working with you, and thanks for being on our Shop Talk.
Oh, it's just such a great thing to have these kinds of discussions and make them available and see where they go from here. So any other time, Chad, pleasure working with you, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Greg.